You ready, Aaron? Oh, good morning. It's 13th, right? February? Or we're going backwards in time. Of April. And this is Odessa Wesleyan Church, a journey through the Bible. And today we're going to start off in 1 Samuel chapter 27. Kind of ended up where we were last week. And I want to read to you down a little bit here. And so, First Samuel, uh, chapter 27, verse 1. David said in his heart, "I shall now perish one day by the hand of Saul. There is nothing better for me than that I should speedily escape the Philistines, and Saul shall despair of me, see me more in the coast of Israel, so I shall escape out of his hand." And David arose, and he passed over 600 over with the 600 men that were with him to Achish, the son of Maon, king of Gath. David dealt with Achish at Gath, and he and his men, and every man in his household, even David and his two wives. It was told to Saul that David fled to Gath. Saul sought him no more. So remember the confrontation, two different confrontations that David had when he was become this, I guess we could call self-imposed exile, Saul-imposed exile, that David finally realized that Saul's serious, that no matter what David does to try to appease the situation, the only way that Saul is going to stop pursuing David is when he has his head on the stick and posted outside his palace. That's just the ugly truth. So David, being smart, runs away, and remember last week we talked about he's out in the desert, the no man's wilderness, where nobody really lives, and Saul's still pursuing him. And two different occasions, it seems to us, in our human eyes, David had an opportunity to put a sword through Saul's heart. Not in battle, but just it seemed that Saul was delivered into David's hands, and he could take him out. And really, humanly, we could probably argue with this. David was anointed king. Saul was rejected as king. Saul's been trying to take David's life for, we believe, probably for years this has been going on. And David now being the next rightful king, how better to end this exile, to end this civil war that's going on? Right? But two different times, David said, no. Even though God rejected Saul, Saul was anointed. We talked a little bit about that, and we may go in a little bit more depth about that. But remember the holiness, the importance, the sacredness of being anointed. Literally, the priest is representing God's hand on you. And so David said, that happens to me. I'm not going to, if God wants to put me on the throne, God's going to put me on the throne. I'm not going to put myself on the throne. Which, spiritually, wow. How many times have we thought, well, God wants me to do this. I'm just going to reach out and grab it and, kind of move God along. God's working too slow. So I'm going to do it. And how many times does it blow up in our face? I thought I was doing something right. I thought I was doing good. It's because we're trying to do things our way in our time. We have patience. So David didn't take those opportunities, you know. So he finally realizes there's no safe place in Israel. And maybe he probably could have went back to the Judah, who again, remember, he is of the tribe of Judah, the largest, most powerful state, province, whatever word you want to use, tribe, Israel. This is his homeboy. He's got all the electoral votes from Judah. He could have went back there and they could have said, "Yeah, come get him, Saul. You and the rest of the nation." Right? Yeah. Because we believe that Judah probably was well over 50% of the population of Israel at this time. So but David again, what kind of leader, what kind of nation would he have if he finally won, which he knew he would by God's hand, a civil war? You know, yeah, you now have the throne, but your country's scattered. There's all these feelings, all this in our own history, in our own country. The day after we surrendered, the U.S. didn't become a one big happy nation and we helped each other. There was wounds. Still feeling 2025, from that time. So there was a lot of reasons. So what does David do? He's land of his enemies. Understand them. What are the climate? The spiritual climate. That a true follower of God, the anointed next king, the one that's promised that from him to eternity, there would be one of his descendants who was on the throne. Goes to the land of the Philistines because he feels that's the safest. Have you ever felt like that? You ever felt that those who don't share your outlook in life, your spiritual attitude, your morals, your ethics, are safer to be around those who claim to do it? We were having this discussion. If you show up early in our church, Pastor Timmy and I, we honestly try to come here early. We try to ignore each other in our offices, do stuff that we had. Unfortunately, because we're both so busy, Sunday mornings, timeless. And we were talking about this, that sometimes, I shouldn't say sometimes, people who are not in the light of God's truth treat each other better than the people who claim to be in the light. And that's sad. And that's totally against what God's saying. So there's like a spiritual example of where David is. That he felt the same. Remember the Philistines? Remember what they sang about David? All his killed, David has killed thousands of Philistines. The guy who every time his king sent him against the Philistines, defeated them, seeks refuge with the Philistines because his own home turned against him. Have you ever been through times when the very foundations of life are ripped out from underneath you? Things you sat your feet on, you thought were the most secure, and you're flying through here. This is where David's existing. You know, I cannot, well, I shouldn't say cannot imagine, because I've been in that different times like that. But to be promised the throne of Israel, to be shepherd boy, the youngest of this family, incident out in the country, and all of a sudden the high priest of your nation comes in and pours oil on you, puts his hands on you, and says, "You're the next king." And then you go and you kill this giant. People are celebrating you. And then the king gives you his daughter. You become the king's son-in-law, and you live right next door to the palace. And then the king, the next heir of the throne, but he's not going to be the next heir. Instead of him turning against you, becomes your best, closest friend. All of this success, and now you've got a borrowed sword, living in caves in the land of your enemies. That's where David is. So let's learn some things about how he dealt with it. Let's look at chapter 27, and then down into chapter 28. At the end of that. 1 Samuel. So David didn't change who he was. Takeaway. I want you to take away from this. All this stuff I just talked about, and we've been talking about David didn't change. God in name. That he sought a place to settle. He didn't, in verse 5, that he didn't become a Philistine, even though he was living in the land of enemies. What he did was very smart. He refused to go battle against his brother. He said to the Philistines, he eventually becomes the bodyguard to one of the kings, the kings of Gath. Now remember, where did we hear about the city of Gath? Back at the beginning of 1 Samuel. Remember that was where the ark was placed, the very first city of Gath. These people are kind of familiar with the Israelite religion and the Israelite God. And being the time period, I'm not sure, my theory, but could the king of Gath be Gath when that ark showed up and ended up, being judged by God and having the boils and having seeing, Baal knocked on his face and his arms broke off? Not a lot of years have gone by. This happened. Maybe a couple decades, maybe 30 years. Could be. Was he a young man? What did his father tell him about this? When, this was still in people's memory. Our memories are pretty good. We could tell stories 30 years ago. What happened? 40 years. So all of a sudden, this guy and where Gath is located is very close. So even though it's a coastal town, it's very close to the border of Israel. So they're familiar with Israel. They're familiar. They're hearing the stuff because you'll see here in some of these in this chapter where some of the leaders will say, "That's David, the one that you're about, killing us, and now he's your bodyguard. Are you insane?" Pastor Brian, I translate. But he didn't become one of them, even though he had to live in the land of his enemies. He didn't become a Philistine. He didn't go out and kill Israelites. Maybe that could have been just do a little peace treaty here with Gath. Gath, I'll use his army to go defeat Saul. And then we'll deal with the political consequences later. David didn't do that. He knew that this was the safe place because he wasn't just looking out for his being a warrior. He knew the risk. But he still had a family. And by this point, he took on two wives. Basically, Saul kind of created a court that I don't think at that time in Israel. That you're not married to this guy that you've been married to. That's married to it. And one of his daughters. No, you're not married to him anymore. Whatever reason Saul did that. I guess being the king, being the king is good, right? You get a lot of power. And so David lost his first wife. But by this point, he takes on two other wives. Again, different culture, we've talked about. So now he has family, and I believe he probably has children. And still, being a former shepherd, what do you think one of the things that David always had around him? Sheep. Once you're a shepherd, you're always a shepherd. You had that love. So I think, and especially being an exile, sheep are one type of herd animal that you want very easy to be mad because they can pretty much find something to eat, wherever. They have something to eat and something to drink. Sheep are good. They don't eat a lot of extra animals. So David ended up going and fighting other enemies of the Philistines, but at the same time, enemies that Saul was ignoring because his hatred of David, spending all of his time pursuing David instead of Saul going after these other enemies living on the border that are attacking the Israelites and stealing their land. David's doing this. What's he doing? Kind of making good with the land of the enemies. Even though he's kind of fibbing a little bit. Where'd you go? Well, I went against this Israelite. Kind of went to their area, he didn't really enemies in the Israel. But he's also, again, word of mouth. They didn't have the internet. They didn't have newspapers. Word of mouth. Yeah, Saul drove David out. He's looking for Philistines, but attacking this group and this group that are fighting against. What's he doing? He left us with what's going on here. So when in the future, this is usually our Philistines, you marched against us, that the intelligence that God gave David, not even though he had to live in the land of his enemy, not he. And for those of us as Christians, that's a struggle. You know, at church we can good little Christians and do our stuff, but then doors open, depending how long Pastor Jim talk. Sometimes noon, sometimes 12:30. That the doors open, we go back out there where there's not a lot of church. We have to live Christian life. How do we live in the land of our exile? We are living in exile until the day God brings us into heaven. And so we have to kind of learn that we live in exile. We're very using intelligence that God uses not to, I'm going to be Philistine in the Philistines area, but when I cross back over Israel, you know, that to be very smart. So even though he was living this way, that there came a time, great battle. You know, Saul decided to fight against the Philistines who were out. So the Philistines decided to capture them. We don't really know. Again, we've talked a lot of times about that when there's internal turmoil in a nation, in a society, that not only damages, but then your outside enemies, no matter how powerful you are. We saw this in Egypt, we saw this, northern Mesopotamia, that, you'll see this throughout history, that when an empire crumbles, it's because it starts first, not because we talk about Rome, about how, the northern Germanic tribes invaded Rome and sacked Rome, and it was kind of the end of the Roman Empire. For years, that wasn't the root cause. That was the final, you know, straw. What happened before was the weakness, and this is what's going on. This internal weakness. So Saul's spending all this time not pursuing the Philistines, not building his nation up, but chasing one of his former generals around, saying that he's a treason and wasting resources. While the Philistines go, if all five of us kings get together, we can eliminate this Israelite problem once. Hey, we got the former king. Well, maybe Achish, the king of Gath, was thinking, go and defeat these Israelites. Maybe we could set David up as a puppet king that make him king of Israel, but he's a vassal, a servant of the Philistines. So for whatever reason, I think David kind of went, oh, me and my group of warriors here, I guess we're gonna go, with them. All the other leaders of the Philistines said, wait a second, this guy, is he gonna start stabbing us in the back? Is he gonna run? Is he go back to our cities and conquer our cities while we're out fighting? No, we don't want this guy here. David puts up a good. But as we move into chapter 29, not only was David living in this land of his enemies, he had his enemies' respect. That he still stayed true to his God so much that his enemies said, "What of us?" Yeah, he's a mighty warrior. In his opinion, he's been faithful to me. but he's not one of us. That that's the key for us. That, again, remember, think of ourselves as an exile. Our home is not here, but you can't just build buildings all huddled together and put a fence around, our church and not contact the land that we live in. We still need to live among those who don't serve God. So live so no one will find you unfaithful to God. Verse 6, live so your enemies, the enemies of God, acknowledge that you serve God. Since we're in exile, choice number one is huddle together, close ourselves off. Choice number two is to live so much in the land of the Philistines that people look at us and say, well, yeah, you used to be Israelite, but you're more a Philistine than you are an Israelite. Choice number three is to live as a servant of God so that people understand and know without a doubt that you are God. And notice here, David must have been living very consistent in front of his enemies, his relationship, as did his friends. It would probably have been very easy in living in the caves, living in the towns that the Achish gave David to live in. Very easy. You're among friends. You're among people of your culture, of your religion. Very easy to live that. Very easy to do that on Sunday morning together. Challenging to hate that and go back into the land of exile and live for God. So even though Achish challenged him, you know, David said there in verse 8, what did I do? Why are you pushing me away? I'm your servant. And this is what the sworn enemy, the Philistine, who sees an Israelite and has the opinion a good Israelite is a dead Israelite. And Achish responds to David on this, what have I done? I know that you are as blameless in my sight as an angel. He didn't say an angel of Baal. The word here, angel of God. You, even though I don't share your beliefs, your religion, you, David, are blameless in the eyes of your God. Nevertheless, the commanders of the Philistines said, "You shall not go with us to battle." So he sends them home. So David and his men return home. So that kind of, I think, internally, there was probably a sigh of relief, not only from David, but his men. You want us to go fight against our brothers? You want us to go fight against our fellow countrymen? I don't know where we're going. What are we going to do? What's Commander David's plan here? And maybe there was a little bit of sigh of relief. We don't have to face this challenge. So they go back home. You think life was good. He returned home, this town of Ziklag, to find it a burning heap. Because the Philistines decided to go to war against the Israelites, and then the nomadic people of what we would call the Amalekites, different words throughout history have used Bedouins, but basically the nomadic people from Arabia, who were traders, but also very, very staunch warriors. And basically, we talked about the Philistines early in their history being pirates, barbarians, whatever. Well, Bedouins were the same way. Except on boats, they had camels. They were basically would either trade with you if they saw that you had a lot of military backing, or they would just come in and burn your town to the ground, steal everything you have, kidnap your family, and go off. Well, all the protection, all the warriors are here fighting a war, and all in David's hometown is left unprotected. David comes home to see his this home that he was trying to build. Remember, the home next door to the palace is off limits. The caves are off limits. He's now forced to live in exile in his land of heaven and has built homes. Has sheep, has children running around, and all of a sudden he comes back for not being allowed to be in battle, and it's nothing. His children, his men's children, his wives, their birds, everything gone, everything is smoking ruins. Look at verses 3 through 6. At the real emotion David expressed. Here. David didn't just go in chapter 30. Chapter 30, David's reaction wasn't, oh, okay, well, guess we start all over again. David grieved deeply that we sometimes think that emotions are bad, but God created us with spirit and mind and body. All three. God created us. And that we have real emotions. So when we know about joy, we know about laughter, we are very good at expressing that. But we get uncomfortable with grief, loss. We get uncomfortable with anger. We get really uncomfortable with despair. And the biggest thing bothers the life out of me as somebody who works with people mental health is when I hear Christians being told that you should be anxious, you should be depressed because you're a Christian. It's so God gave us emotions. God wallow in emotions. You, but you doubt me. Very shortest verse in the Bible. When his best friend died, he had been healing people. Jesus stood at Lazarus, and the writer of John says, Jesus, the Son of God, grieved, even though he knew in a few minutes Lazarus is going to be standing next to him, alive as a new baby. Jesus still felt grief and sadness. And so that's the balance. David had this saying, even though he'd been serving God, even though all this stuff was happening, he still wasn't happy. Still was sad. He was still grieving. So what did David do? He saw answers. He saw answers from God. That's the unique thing, that even though he had this emotional outburst, this is David. This is the guy who wrote, "The Lord is my shepherd; I shall not want. When I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil." And he's sitting here crying over what the enemies just did, and angry because his men are blaming him. What does he do? He seeks God. What should I do? What do I do? And God said, "Go get these stolen. Don't tolerate it. Go pursue the enemy. Take that." a lot of times we're very passive in our spiritual life. A lot of times our prayers, God, if you get around to it, it'd be really nice if instead of in the spiritual realm, you believe in God, also you believe Satan. Satan doesn't have the right. He doesn't have the right to throw that temptation at you. He doesn't have a right to cause your loved one harm. He doesn't have a right to do that. God tolerates his power until he has judgment. Satan judgment. All yeah, passive. And, if you disagree with me, I refer you over to Ephesians. Saul Tucker, the Apostle Paul talks about battling the spiritual realm with the armor of God. You don't wear the armor. You don't put on a military uniform and clean your weapon if you want to parade in front of the president. That's not what we're going to do. I remember a radio commentator said the purpose of a nation's army is to break things. And that's spiritual sometimes we get that God has promised us victory. Victory sometimes is not going to come to us. We need to with the sword, wipe the tears, blow your nose, even when you're at the lowest point of your life. But, chapter 39 through 16. But, you stumble upon this man in the desert, dying of thirst, probably dying of hunger, maybe had some wounds on him, had some blood on him. What is the enemy? Kill him. Let's torture him. Let's beat information out of him. Turns out he was a slave, stolen, probably from Egypt, just like David's sons and daughters and wives were. But he gave mercy in the midst of his anger, even in the midst of his sadness. Still gave mercy. Beat this guy. No, let's tie him to a tree and beat the snot out of him and let him, have him tell us. We don't know who this guy is. He says he's a slave. Well, I would say I'm a victim of the enemy too. If my enemies are standing there with their sharpened swords, looking, I think, yeah, hey, no, hey guys, I was kidnapped into this as well. Yeah, but David said, give him mercy, feed him, give him water. That sometimes in the battle, that give mercy to the strangers in you. Because sometimes it's the spiritual battle, and it's living this life in exile, that we are the ones who need to give mercy to strangers. But we need to give mercy to friends who are weak. Because in these verses here, we see the same thing, unique thing. These guys were all ramped up for battle. They were over here on the border of Israel, ready to fight against Saul. Marched back, get to their homeland and see burning wreck, not knowing if their sons, their daughters, their wives are alive. The possessions they'd stored up are now gone. And it's been days probably pursuing raiders, and they get overcome. And they get overcome. And what does David do? The weaklings, soldiers, you are my mighty men. No. Okay, you guys stay here. Fight in our load. We're going to leave all of our baggage. You're going to guard. We'll be there. And so they go, and the rescue party shows up. It's everything. So now they plundered the plunderers. Because again, remember, these guys didn't these guys were going down the coast because, again, all the Philistines are over here. So I think they were going city to city, town to town, and they had a bounty. Plus, they've been other places raiding. David took all the enemy's stuff that he had stolen and stole it back. And so they show back up to the luggage depot. And David says, okay, divide the spoils. Wait a minute. We're the ones with blood on our hands. We're the ones that fought the battle. These guys stayed back and rested. David set out a unique rule that we were all equal. And so he gave mercy to those guys. Give them back everything and divide the spoils among us because they fought, even though they may have stumbled. And sometimes we do that in our own lives. People who stumble, people who sometimes just can't hold it up. Instead of judging them, give them mercy and support them. So, have you ever been betrayed? Have you ever been labeled something that you knew you were not? Have you ever been ever been accused of something you never did, you never had intention to do, you never even had a thought of doing? Don't answer this out loud, those of you here. What were your reactions? What were your thoughts? What were your feelings? David was betrayed by the Ziphonites. The Ziphonites were a clan in Judah. They were his brothers, not just brothers in the Lord, as sometimes we'll say here, or a brother in Christ. They were literally his relatives, his cousins. And what they do? They ran to Saul and said, hey, that guy you want to murder, he's right over here. What do you think is going to happen to your cousin if you rat him out to the guy who wants to kill him? The king's going to kill him. David was accused of treason. You just want my throne. You just want, to take my head and take everything that I have. This is Saul, the donkey herder. This is the Saul wandering around searching for his father's donkeys not too long before. Everything that Saul had was because of God's grace. David was pursued as a traitor. That he ran to the Philistines and sought protection. Our enemies, our greatest enemies in our history. And where does he go? He goes there. And he'd been living there for a while, and Achish makes him his bodyguard. But then other people around him influence Achish to say, hey, this guy's a traitor. This guy's going to turn on us. So how did David react? What was David thinking? Well, one of the things I do when I research history is I like to go to the source. If I'm reading about President Lincoln, I like to read President Lincoln's words, not a historian. It doesn't matter how many doctorate degrees and years the biographer, the historian has been studying Lincoln. I like to go to Lincoln to see what Lincoln said about that. Sometimes it's very challenging to do that in history. But you know what? We have David's words during this time, whether he wrote it during this time or he was reflecting during this time. Psalm 54, not Psalm 154. I apologize for that last week. Psalm 54. I'm going to read to you, and I'm going to read to you the whole psalm. That sometimes we start at verse 1 when we read the Psalms, and we forget the introduction. And again, as we talked about last week, these Psalms were written as personal prayers, as songs of worship, songs of teaching, but came from the believer's heart. Psalm 54. One of the few Psalms that has a title. And the version of the Bible, the translation of the Bible I'm using actually puts the title on. The Lord upholds my life. And the note that he writes here, to the choir master with stringed instruments, a maskil of David, when the Ziphonites went and told Saul, Is not David hiding among us? Again, hear the words of David. And again, all that we were talking about, put your mind in where David was. And then at the end of this, answer this question for yourself. If I have circumstances like David, do I react the same way? Oh God, save me by your name and vindicate me by your might. Oh God, hear my prayer. Give ear to the words of my mouth. For strangers have arisen against me. Ruthless men seek my life. They do not set God before themselves. That word you see there, Selah, means pause, rest. Whether the music's playing or there's just silence for you to reflect. Behold, God is my helper. The Lord is the upholder of my life. He will return the evil to my enemies. In your faithfulness, put an end to them. With a free will offering, I will sacrifice to you. I will give thanks to your name, O Lord, for it is good. For he has delivered me from every trouble, and my eyes have looked in triumph of my enemies. So, how should we react if we're like David, forced into exile? If people are constantly judging our intentions when we're living for God? When everything we have is a smoking ruins, when our family's ripped out of our sight? First of all, acknowledge salvation. Verses 1 and 2, and then verse 4. If the only way you're going to get out of this mess is by God's hand, and turn to God. Recognize the battle is not human strength alone, but God's strength. Verse 3. That it's God, that this life that we live, and I'm not one person to say, there's a demon ever behind every sneeze. I'm not saying that. But I'm saying that we need to have this balance, that we live this life, but at the same time, there's a spiritual battle going around us. And the balance is to live our life realizing that just because you're a Christian doesn't mean from that point on life's going to be cherry pie and coffee and happiness and hugs. Once we get to heaven, it's going to be like that. It's going to be the best time in your life. But here on earth, there's going to be battles. There's going to be challenges. There's going to be heartaches. There's going to be wounds, because no soldier who's a successful soldier goes into a battle and doesn't get some type of wound. Physical, emotional, mental. Nobody comes out of a battle unscathed. But sometimes we think, because we're serving God, that God's going to protect the very most important part of your life, your soul. He will not, as long as you remain faithful to him, he will not let your soul be harmed. So like David, who faithfully served God, even during the difficult times, difficult circumstances, we too have this challenge to remain faithful for God. And why do we remain faithful to God? Because he's faithful. Not because he's some very, very big, scary, God in the sky that wants to whack you the side of the head every time you fail even a little bit. Not that he has evil, intentions for your life. But we serve God because he is more than faithful. Period. David knew that. As we go on in our study of David, we're going to find that sometimes David forgot that and what happened. But in this point in his life, coming back to have to rebuild his life, seeing the battle going on between your homeland and your enemies, and all the things that David has gone through over the years. This all didn't happen within months. Keep this in mind. This has been happening over years. These last few weeks we've been talking about it. David remained faithful to God because he knew God would be faithful. So for next week, we're going to switch switch our focus from David back to Saul, because again, I talked about a couple weeks ago how two things are going on here in the timeline, and it's a little confusing to flip back and forth. The Bible does that, but I want to kind of flip our focus back to now. Remember, this battle's going on. What's Saul doing during this battle, and what happens to Saul, and how that affects the history of Israel? So chapters 28 and 31, and then into 2 Samuel, chapter 1. So 1 Samuel 28 and chapter 31, and then 2 Samuel chapter 1 and Psalm 18. All right, let's close in prayer. Lord, you are faithful. You know that. You tell us that. You show us that. But we forget that. Lord, this week, as we enter into what in church history we call Holy Week, remind us of your faithfulness. And even though we see the cost to you of your faithfulness, help us to be faithful to you, even if the cost is great. In your name, amen. All right, you folks have a good week. We'll see you next week.